Yeah.
Um, and we're live on YouTube. It is Thursday, June 17th, 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time. It's 4:04 p.m. in Texas, right? I think.
Yes, same time as in Chicago.
Okay, that's what I thought. And we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to be here with Kate Masur, who is at Northwestern University's history department and a professor, and the author most recently of a new book about doing justice to American civil rights history. Kate, it's so great to have you on.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. I want to just say how this all came about, which is that a bunch of people in we call them the Greek chorus, like the side chat is the great, requested you over and over again. And so I wrote you probably one of the more bizarre invitations you've ever received as a very well-ranked and senior historian in American history, which was like, hey, do you want to be on Kate Week? So I was so glad that you said yes.
There are a lot of really great Kates out there, so I thought if I make the cut, that's amazing. I'll be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with that. There's a Kate question we're asking all the Kates this week, which is, how would your life have been different if you had not been would you be a esteemed historian, or would you, how much of your life and success do you attribute to being a Kate?
I don't know, but I do know that I have always been Kate. I was called Kate from the beginning. My parents intended me to be called Kate. Apparently had a debate about whether to give me the longer name Catherine or not, because it was irrelevant because I was going to be Kate. But my full name is actually Catherine. And also, when I was a kid and people would infantilize, kind of make it into Katie, and they would often assume that that I was oh, Katie, I always corrected them. So it's just been my name always. I never chose it. Except for the fact that I adamantly defended it. So yeah, it's really part of my identity. And I made a choice also when I had to start publishing stuff to not use Catherine and to just keep Kate. So
we just talked about this. We just talked about this with Kate Shaw yesterday, who's at Cardozo Law School, and she was saying that she published. She was regretting it that she published under Catherine, but goes by Kate, and also publishes on Popular Press by Kate, and so she kind of hates it. And I said, oh no, I went by Kate early. It was great. I also do remember, bless you for saying this. I can't believe I haven't shared this until day 4 of Kate Week. But you mentioned the Katie thing, and I came home one day. My parents tell the story of coming home in kindergarten and being I am Kate. My name is Kate and not Katie. And that was it. And that was the death of Katie. And after that, it was just
Is there a rivalry between Kates and Katies?
No.
When you meet a Katie, do you say you really shouldn't be going by that?
Oh, that is really lame.
And they look at you and you say you're this whole Kate thing is really insufficiently diminutive. Do you guys judge each other?
No. I don't.
No.
Really,
and one of my best friends in high school, probably my best friend, her name was Katie. And she goes by Kate now. Shout out Kate Diana. But when she grew up, she became Kate. But it was Kate and Katie. It was totally fine. By the way, I have to add, just for this occasion, I have one sibling, a brother, and his name is Ben. Okay, Ben.
Ooh.
Yeah. Now, Ben is simple, though, because all Benjamins go by Ben.
Yeah.
There is virtually nobody who uses Benjamin. It's not like Daniel, there are people who are really there aren't that many Benjamins all go by Ben, and nobody uses Benny or Benji. Except very small children. So it's very simple, but Catherine, there's oh my God, there's so many options.
Yeah. No, it truly is. I would say that's the kind of the discussion I have with people that are named Kate, is like how you spell it, or like what the larger version of it is. Although I will say this, that there is, both of my federal judges that I clerked for called me Katie and KK. And like
I think that was a power trip.
I know.
Without knowing anything about them.
No, they were, I mean, I love them. They were wonderful. And I'm like, you can call me like Fred. I don't really care. You're like a federal judge. But
I call you KK, but that's different.
Well, KK is fine. KK is like a nickname.
It's KK is your initials.
Yeah.
It's KK.
But I don't mind. My grandfather called me Katie. And like when older men, it's always older men, call me Katie. I don't know. I just don't take offense to names.
No, that's obnoxious.
No, I don't. It doesn't bother me.
People should be called what they want to be called.
Yeah.
All right.
Like I just like, but anyway, but it just doesn't bother me, and I like kind of roll with it. And most people call me Kate. But it's so great to have you, Kate. And I'm going to put a link to your book in the chat right now, and we don't have to talk about this. Although when I was looking at kind of your background and everything that you've been working on, it seems like this came out very recently. And it seems incredibly timely, and like a great project. And we're coming up on kind of Juneteenth, and like a moment of a lot of kind of understanding and like a reckoning in civil rights history. And so, well, also given like kind of some of the opinions out of the court today. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, if you could tell us what the book is about, and kind of your path to starting to write it.
Sure. Okay. So I'm a historian, basically. I'm an American historian. And I, in the past, have always written typically about the Civil War and Reconstruction period. So I mainly work on the 19th century and issues about race, emancipation, like the end of slavery, law, politics, and stuff like that. So this book came out in March with Norton. It's called Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. And what it looks at is a struggle over race and rights, and I call them civil rights. We can talk about the definition of civil rights at that time, or why I use that term, but the struggle over race and rights basically in the antebellum North, from the period of the American Revolution through up until and including the Civil War and the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was the first federal civil rights statute. And, one of the central arguments in the book is that those measures, the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment, typically people say that they were the product of sort of emergency lawmaking right at the moment, 1865, looking at what southern states are doing in terms of black codes, and Congress says we've got to act, and they come up with these measures. And what my book argues is that actually the ideas and the frameworks for thinking about race and rights came out of a decades-long struggle over racial equality in the antebellum North. And I look at that movement, right? And I look at debates within states about these anti-black laws, particularly in the Midwestern states. I look at arguments over whether the Constitution, particularly Article 4, Section 2, which is the original Privileges and Immunities Clause, was supposed to protect the rights of free African-American citizens of their home states when they travel to other states. And I just kind of talk about different configurations of this movement that was basically critical of laws that constrained and discriminated against free black people, and then how the movement goes from the margins of Northern kind of politics into the mainstream and eventually is kind of represented in the Republican Party. So that at the point when you get Republicans elected to federal office in 1860, you actually have a critical mass of powerful politicians who are ready to implement these kind of measures. And I talk about sort of the constitutional politics around that. So that's what the book does over the course of 9 chapters. And I didn't mention how I got to write this book, but I'm happy to talk about that too.
So
Yeah.
Please do.
Go ahead.
And then I have a sort of broad question about the thesis as you've just articulated it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
No, please.
I mean, my first book, which started out as my dissertation, we were talking earlier, I went to Michigan for graduate school, and anyway, my dissertation was about the Civil War and Reconstruction in DC proper. So it's actually a history of DC. It's called An Example for All the Land, and it came out in 2010. And that book has a lot to do with I mean, local DC politics, city government, but also the ways that the District of Columbia was a place on which Congress experimented, right? Because Congress had special jurisdiction there. And so some of it's about, that's why it's called an example for all the land, because it's about Congress kind of making DC an example, both in terms of like racial equality measures early on in Reconstruction, and then in terms of reactionary politics in the 1870s. And I was coming to the end of writing that book, and I was trying to write a sentence in the introduction that said something like, of course, Republicans came into office ready to implement not just abolishing slavery where they could, but also some kind of regime of racial equality before the law. We can see that because they do it right away in DC. They don't just move to abolish slavery, but they also want to repeal the Black codes, the laws that would have kept free Black people as kind of a second class, a marginal class. So they go to repeal those right away with like no debate. And so they must have come into office believing that that was the right thing to do. And we might take for granted that they would believe that, but actually, given the earlier history of the United States, why would you even think that, right? It would be possible. We see it in the North. We see it would be possible to abolish slavery, but keep laws that, create African Americans as second class citizens, if you will. But they didn't do that. And so where's the book? So I was like trying to, write a line like, oh, well, they came into office knowing that they believed in this version of racial equality before the law. Who said that? Who has written that? Who do I cite? And there wasn't really a book on it, right? So it was kind of like, oh, nobody has actually explained how that happened. And actually the prevailing view even though I know this isn't really the prevailing general public view, but in many respects, the prevailing view among historians is that the North, particularly the Midwest, was so unadulteratedly racist in the decades before the Civil War that there's no way that that these Republicans even would have come into office with that kind of worldview. So you had a kind of problem in the historiography of conflicting things going on. Here comes this party that's willing to not just abolish slavery, but also repeal racist laws. But on the other hand, parts of the literature are saying that could never have existed because of the nature of the white North.
That's so fascinating. Go ahead, Ben.
So I'm interested in the stray comment that you made early on in this conversation, in which you said that you're happy to talk about what the word civil rights meant in this period. It's a very tempting idea that there is a kind of continuous civil rights movement from the time of the founding through the Civil War, through Reconstruction. It kind of gets its butt kicked at the end of Reconstruction and kind of struggles through and comes kind of roaring back and starting in the late 40s. I do have the sense, though, that the words meant something very different at different times, and I'm interested in your sense of the evolution of the terminology. There's always been a civil rights movement, but it wasn't always arguing for the same things, or at least different components of the same broad ideas. And so how would you describe the evolution of the terminology and the evolution of the ideology that followed the terminology?
And this is such a good question and a really expansive one. I mean, I'll start with, first of all, I mean, the term civil rights was not an everyday term in, let's say, the early 19th century, but people did use it occasionally. So people have said to me, oh, your subtitle is ahistorical because there was no such thing as civil rights. Nobody talked like that in the early 19th century. That's actually not true. So they did use the term civil rights from time to time. They used other kinds of terminology too. But when people talked about civil rights back then, and they did sometimes talk about it, they were talking about the cluster of rights that are also associated with like life, liberty, and property. I mean, I kind of came to understand that as I went along. So the right to be safe in your body, to own property, and that also includes to be able to go to court to defend it, so to testify in courts, or kinds of procedural rights. And then liberty is usually talked about, and this is kind of like a surmise from the sources, but the ability to move freely from place to place, particularly within your country. So not everywhere has the kind of federalism that we do, but you can see in like early England, and I don't want to talk about that because I'm not, but you can kind of see that moving from parish to parish, things like that in other situations also come to be talked about as liberty, personal liberty. So in the 19th century, in the period that I'm talking about, these kind of rights to personal liberty, to kind of mobility, and to access to the law, to access to property and testimony in court, were the kind of conjunction of rights that people talked about as civil rights. And one of the key distinctions and like things that's really important in my work is they usually cordoned off political rights separately. So when they would talk about civil rights, they usually weren't talking about the right to vote, or hold office or serve on juries. And the right to vote, hold office, and serve on juries were usually categorized as political rights. And,
which is why the 15th Amendment was necessary.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly.
Because the 14th Amendment, which gives you, it says, no state shall abridge the privileges and immunities of a citizen of the United States, isn't understood to include the right to vote.
Right.
So you need a separate amendment.
And they did not understand it that way at that time. And actually, I don't know if you all know Chris Schmidt at Chicago Kent Law School, but he's written a book on kind of evolution of the terminology civil rights in the 20th century, and kind of the whole story that ensues after that, about how, including like how voting gets folded into the story, or how like civil rights comes to, in the mid 20th century, be associated with things like public accommodations. And I'm really interested also in these kind of boundary cases, including public accommodations. And so anyway, but yeah, so there's, by the time of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, there's more of a consolidation of talking about these kinds of rights as civil rights, and that's why it's called the Civil Rights Act, even though they don't use the term in the text of the act itself. But so yeah, there's a kind of evolving discussion, and as you can probably imagine, I mean, if you think historically, it's like the term civil rights and the contents of the term didn't just come into being and was kind of defined instantaneously as a set of things that everyone agreed on. There was actually sort of a process of defining what was inside of that term and kind of consolidating it. And the same is true of citizenship, by the way.
So this is so wonderful. So I grew up in, as people everyone here knows, like I grew up in Rochester, New York, and it was had a very historical background in both the anti-abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement in the first wave of the women's rights movement. And so complicating this idea of civil rights, which I've always kind of folded in together to a certain extent, at least in modern day or in like modern-ish day, the folding of civil rights in with political rights. I'm very curious, like, do you have like those two movements? Maybe not like I mean, it's not actually in complete purview with like the range of dates in your book, but I'm curious if you have any kind of insight about like after the 1860s, after the Civil War, the reclaiming of kind of rights, and the breadth of rights that were kind of being created by not only blacks but women in the United States, and like kind of what that looked like.
So in the period that there's a kind of parallel story about women claiming rights, right? And women claiming rights as women, let's put it this way. And so by the decades before the Civil War, you have women arguing for the repeal of married women's property laws in particular. So it actually turns out, and this is something that I have had a lot of conversations about, and it turns out that, so there's a question of like, did women as women, were they supposedly entitled to these civil rights that we're talking about? And the place where women really get nailed is in marriage, right? So like single women, there's actually not laws that say that single women are not entitled to own property, move from place to place, and so on. But the minute they marry, all of that goes away, right? And they come under their husband's purview. And so the fight for a while is to remove these married women's property laws in particular so that women can continue to own property in their own name even when they are married. And, you know, in some ways, there is a kind of ongoing, you could characterize both this kind of struggle over race and rights and sex and rights as being like an ongoing amplification of the idea that rights will help you in the first place, right? So we can sort of think that, you know, it's not always taken for granted that like rights are the thing that you really need and want anyway, right? So that's part of what's developing in this period too, is a whole set of ideas that like rights are good, individual rights are good, the more people who have them, the better, right? That's not always the prevailing view.
Right up until the ERA. Sorry.
Wait, so I want to.
Yeah, that's my senior. That was my history thesis in graduate, not in graduate school, in undergrad. But yeah.
But I want to explore that because there's a, you know, by the 1760s, there is a very well developed vocabulary among the colonists about the rights of Englishmen, which they are claiming for themselves. And they're claiming it without a whole lot of reservation about, you know, they're not saying, well, this may not be so good for us to have rights. Although there are certain parliamentary apologists who are saying, hey, the king takes care of us. So there is an argument about it. When is the point where, you know, like, there's a certain cognitive dissonance that it must cause to say, hey, Locke is right as applied to me, but it wouldn't be so good for you. Is that discussion explicit, or is it just kind of a latent hypocrisy in what people do and think? I mean, is there a theory, like, is anybody theorizing like who are rights good for and who are they not good for and why? Or is it just like, well, I want my rights, but I really don't want you to have them as well?
Okay, there's some of all of that, of people saying of precisely what you're saying. I want my rights, but I think that Africans are not entitled to the rights that I am entitled to, right? So there's plenty of that. Or I don't think married women should certainly not be entitled to own property because that would tear apart the bonds of family and so on. But I just want to make a different point, which is there's a prevailing let's look at how the colonies and the early United States were governed. And in my book, I write a lot about the police powers of the states. I mean, in addition to all this rights talk, is all of this talk about the common good, the collective well-being, all of the things that governments can do to protect the common good, which can include explicitly denying even white men rights. Right. And that is a really important theme in the history of American government. And so, you know, I have been looking at it in terms of, it's probably overly simplistic, but really like a kind of bifurcated world of, you know, there's the Declaration of Independence, there's Locke, there's all kinds of claims to rights. And then there's how did Americans actually set up their structure of government? Well, you know, the police powers of the states under that, states had incredible power to abridge rights. I mean, they didn't even think of them as rights when they abridged them. And one of the things I write about is the poor laws and how these anti-Black laws in the Midwest in particular were built on top of the structure of poor laws and the poor law tradition. And, you know, most people took for granted that you could regulate the poor, that you could expel them from the community if they became dependent and they didn't have a legal settlement. They did not have
lock up debtors.
Rights. Yeah. And then when you have a class of people, in this case, the people, you know, that people talked about were free African Americans, and you make the argument that they are a threat to the public peace, they're a threat to our, you know, harmony of our community, and therefore we have to impose special regulations on them. It's widely accepted. Right. And so it's for the people in the movement that I write about to say you can't discriminate based on race is what they're saying. And that's the key thing that I'm looking at, is the growth and development of the idea that you cannot discriminate based on race. And again, To our ears, maybe that seems obvious, right? Everybody, but I mean, this was an idea that most white Americans in particular didn't, including in the northern states, did not necessarily accept from the beginning of the United States.
So, who in your research is the first person to articulate non-discrimination as a significant component of the idea of civil rights? It's not just that you get to be secure in your, move around the way you want, not just that you get even voting rights or political rights, but that there's an affirmative non-discrimination argument on the part of the state to enforce and to observe itself, without which you wouldn't call somebody's civil rights complete.
I mean, if I'm understanding your question, like this is the crux of what I'm writing about, right? So there are these ideas out there, like in the Declaration of Independence or whatever, like in early state constitutions, they have declarations of rights that are universal, right? So there are these ideas out there that everyone's entitled to the same basic rights.
Right, but the same state would right, without
exactly.
thinking about it, engage in
right,
segregation.
Slavery, segregation. And so the people I'm writing about were the people who said, you cannot do this, right? This is not American. This is antithetical to what's in the Bible. This goes against. And so these are the people who are making that point.
Okay, but would they have said, so it seems to me one thing to say the Declaration of Independence is in conflict with slavery, right? That is noticed at the founding. It seems to me quite a different thing to say, and by the way, the state cannot treat free black people, all black people should be free, of course, and the state cannot disfavor them or treat them differently from white people. I don't remember in my sort of antebellum, like, reading of like, I don't remember the anti-discrimination principle being especially prominent in the abolitionist writing. It's all about the evils of slavery.
That's why you should read my book. That's
I was just going to say.
I mean, that's what my book's about, right? Is like how they elevated the anti-discrimination principle, and it repeatedly in a variety of different locations, in a variety of different contexts. And so, right, the reason why I wrote the book and the reason why, somebody was willing to publish it is because people didn't really, this is kind of a new thing for people.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It is really great. And can I just say, like, so if I'm understanding this correctly, and it just really seems to me like your point that you were writing the end of your thesis and you came to this book, like, seems to me like, first of all, I completely understand that. That is literally how I've come to all of my writing projects. But the other is that, like, there seems to be a really wonderful, very commonsensical premise here, which is like, how do we measure discrimination? Yes, we can all be anti-discrimination. We can write a law that says no discrimination, but how are we going to measure such things? Like, are we going to let them sit at our diners? Are we going to let them own property? Are we going to let them do this? Like, there's all of there is, like, and this is, like, actually in a lot of ways kind of what the law I do in law and tech, which is like, you can write a law and it has absolutely nothing about all of those things in it. And the figuring out of the compliance and what that means and how we as a society are going to decide what compliance means with that law is what's so powerful. And that seems like kind of what you've done here in a lot of ways. Before there were these ideas of disparate impact, before there were these ideas of let's measure something, like, but this was like before measuring. But we had slide rules. And, like, that was not much good for, but so is that kind of like, am I kind of like understanding correctly, like, how you feel about your project in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ben's point is really apt. Like, first of all, is that this was going on, but people didn't know about it because historians and other people have been so obsessed with looking at slavery. And we've, done how many, angels on the head of a pin about varieties of anti-slavery ideology, varieties of abolitionists, like, abolitionist constitutionalism. I mean, we sort of plumbed that. And I felt like people haven't, there's this whole other thing, which is not, I mean, it's also about historians' obsession with the causes of the Civil War, which is not an unimportant question, but it's like, I'm actually interested in like causes of the 14th Amendment, right? Or causes of the Civil Rights Act, and where did those ideas come from? So I'm not trying to account for the sectional conflict. I'm asking a different question from what people have asked before. I mean, to your point, Kate, like I think that what they're starting with is repeal of discriminatory laws. So like what you have to do first is you have racist laws on the books. They don't just have a discriminatory impact. They are like textually discriminating based on race.
Explicitly racist.
Yeah. Yeah. And so my people
the per se like racism, yes.
They're like, public schools are being established in the state of Ohio. They are for white students only. That's one of the laws, right? You know, Black residents of Ohio have to register with county officials and show their free papers and pay a cost to the county clerk in order to register to show that they have a settlement, so they can't be like summarily thrown out of their community. So these are like explicitly, you know, facially racist laws. And so the group that I'm writing about is like working on repealing these laws, and they're saying this is unfair, this is unacceptable, we cannot have this. And so this is another reason that I don't see it as all one continuous civil rights struggle. It's like different iterations, because you get to a point in the United States where you can't have those laws anymore, right? Like something we kind of take for granted. Now we have to look at the racially discriminatory impact of facially race neutral laws, as I understand it, right? And like, so you can't have laws that explicitly discriminate based on race, but you can still figure out that they're having a racially discriminatory impact. But but before we get to that, we have to have this fight over whether it's even okay to have laws that are explicitly discriminatory.
No,
so
completely.
Who were these people? You say people were campaigning to get rid of an Ohio registration and white students only law. Was this primarily African American Ohio residents? Was it primarily abolitionists and people who were otherwise engaged in sort of various abolitionist activities? What was the coalition that was opposing laws like that like?
So you have a whole range of people, Black people who are organizing and in their own communities. So let's take Ohio, for example. So it's Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana of the Midwestern states, this kind of southern band of Midwestern states, have these types of laws. And so African Americans organize in their own communities to, basically what you're going to have to do is somehow persuade the state legislature to repeal the laws, right? But African Americans were like 1% of the population of Ohio, not evenly distributed throughout the state. And Black men were not allowed to vote, right? And so how do you get these laws repealed? You have to persuade white people. You have to get white people on your side, in part. And so African Americans themselves petitioned the state legislature, and I write a lot about petitioning and the process of petitioning, and how actually petitions, the conventions around petitions were that state legislatures or any body that received a petition kind of had to respond in some way. So this petitioning, both by Black folks and white folks, generates reports out of the state legislature that are then used by the media, sort of newspapers, amplify these reports. And you may have like a report saying, most of the reports were saying, we have to keep these Black laws for the following reasons. Like I was saying before, we have to secure our state and our community against this dangerous influx of people coming from Virginia and Kentucky. They're criminals, blah, blah, blah. But then you might have a minority report written by just one state legislature who would say, these laws are unjust, they're unfair. And, so the press could do things with that. They could amplify the report that's really racist and say, look at how horrible the state legislature is in Ohio. Or they could amplify the minority report and say, we're making progress, this is great. So there are these kind of political strategies that they use. White abolitionists are involved. So if you think about it, and this again goes to the large literature on abolitionism, they were not only, if you were in Ohio and you were a white abolitionist, you cared about getting rid of slavery in whatever other state, but you also couldn't do anything about it, right? Besides petition the Congress or whatever. And so at home, what was their program at home? They wanted to repeal these types of black laws, right? So they petitioned also. And then I write about how they start to form they start to get into third party politics. And there's actually a big strategic debate among some of these people about whether to form a third party that will ostensibly like disrupt the two major parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, and kind of siphon people off, or whether to stick with one of the major parties and try to persuade them to take a stand against the black laws. And then the other thing I would add that I found that was kind of interesting was, in addition to like the usual suspects of white abolitionists plus black activists of various kind, including people who started newspapers and were editors and things like that, were some amount of white businessmen who, especially ship captains, who were dealing with this phenomenon of their sailors who sailed out of like New York City and Boston, who would be incarcerated and kind of threatened with jail time in southern ports. These merchants actually got involved in this too. And I think they had a combination of motives, both, you know, a kind of moral opposition to these kind of laws, but also they were very inconvenienced by these laws because they interfered with their ability to do business. And so we find some very like prominent business types from Boston and New York who were not necessarily associated with the abolitionist movement, who called for more protection of the rights of free black sailors. And let me just say one more thing. The white people that I write about are not the usual suspects in the abolitionist movement either. So it's not really William Lloyd Garrison and his group, because they tried to stay out of politics. So
yeah, they didn't believe in law.
Yeah, right. And they didn't believe in participating in elections. They didn't believe in running for office. They didn't believe in voting particularly. And so the white abolitionists that I'm writing about are the people who believed strongly in politics and saw politics as like the way to make change. And I found all of that extremely compelling, right? Because it's about identifying like the state and is the place where power resides, and, you know, going there at whatever level, whether it's like federal or state or local, to try to get things done.
Yeah. So just to kind of sum up and kind of tail on to Ben's question before we go to audience questions. So is kind of which is what you're saying is making me think like, so is the general takeaway of the white, maybe not abolitionists, but the people who voted or supported the change in kind of legal regimes around race, like their motivations were predominantly like, were they like, it seems like you're saying that there was a lot of them who just really felt like the tide was turning and this was no longer a morally correct stance. And that's kind of like hard to like kind of, it's like, I think that it is like a lot of people take it for granted, because looking back at norms and how norms change and how moral kind of certitude changes around these types of things, it's easy to kind of be like, well, of course they thought this was terrible. Like, of course they thought slavery and like this injustice was terrible. But like when everyone else is doing this thing, like like it just seems like a very profound and I actually think this ties into why slavery as an institution is like the through line of so much of the historical conversation around these things, because it's an industry and people can really understand slavery as an industry, as a labor market, as like this idea that they can be like, well, people didn't want this or did want this because it meant money. And like it didn't matter that there were like moral rights attached to it in certain degrees. But like the story you're telling seems like much more profound. It seems like you're making the market argument like a much different, like setting it off to the side and kind of showing the politics and the moral structure that changed over time.
I think so. I mean, I also think everyone constantly talked about the morality of slavery. And so, I mean, there were, for every, you know, person who said that it was, you know, of course, I'm invested in slavery. I have, you know, literally invested and therefore I'm going to continue to support it. There were people who were constantly saying that's not okay. Right. But I mean, in this case, it is, and I thought about this a lot when I was writing the book, like, when you study the 20th century, you can go to opinion polling at a certain point, right? We have a history of opinion polling. You can start to sort of actually chart empirically like how public opinion had changed on certain kinds of issues, where it was at a different moment. But I didn't have any access, we don't have anything like that for the 19th century. But what we can see, and I think there's a kind of dialectic or something between political leadership and kind of the grassroots. So what you see in the 1850s is the rise of the Republican Party because of a variety of different kinds of, cataclysms and events. You have the formation of a new party that draws on a bunch of different strands in American politics. The thing they come together on is well known as kind of opposition to the continued extension of slavery. And yet embedded in the Republican Party, for the most part, is this position on racial equality before the law. And you can kind of, and you can, that could only have happened, A, if the political leadership in the party was willing to take those positions, and B, if enough people had been willing to support or at least go along with them because they believed in something larger, right? And so, it's sort of like we have the evidence that we have to work with, but clearly where in the, let's say 1840, it was not even like on the horizon that there could have been a majority party that could have gotten a president elected where this was central to their belief system. And then by 1860 there was. So all I can do is kind of look at the facts on the ground.
And yet even their conception, even the most so-called radical Republican of that time would not have argued against the legality or propriety of private sector discrimination, right? In other words, the Civil Rights Acts of 64, which said, which had these public accommodation provisions, has a conception of civil rights that is federal enforcement of non-discrimination against private actors that would have been beyond the conception of civil rights, even of the most radical people of the era you're focusing on. Or did some of them have that conception as well?
They definitely, some of them did. I mean, for example, there was a whole fight, and also one of the reasons why we don't know that much about this is because we look at the federal level, and most of, certainly before the Reconstruction, all of this stuff was mostly going on at the state level. And so, for example, so in Massachusetts, there's a whole fight about whether the state legislature is going to tell railroad companies that they can't discriminate. And there's a big fight about whether that is in the purview of the legislature or not. And in the end, the railroad companies voluntarily desegregate in order to kind of stop the conversation. And then Massachusetts is actually the first state to pass a civil rights on public accommodations law, or like an anti-discrimination on public accommodations law, which was in 1865. And it's actually Charles Sumner who has a really interesting legal argument that he develops, that is that any entity that's chartered by a public entity like the state government is kind of as good as a public entity, and therefore subject to regulation. And there's questions too about the Civil Rights Act itself, which does not specify state action, right? Like the Civil Rights Act itself says that all citizens are entitled to the same rights to contract and property and things like that as white citizens are. And so then in the enforcement provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, you have some stuff about that it has to be a kind of sometimes either a state actor that is enforcing the discrimination or failing to protect people. But so public accommodations were a gray area in this period as well. And that's why you get the Civil Rights Act of 1875, by the way. I mean, there is an effort to federally ban discrimination in public accommodations, but then it's quickly overturned by the Supreme Court. And then as far as private contracts and things like housing, I mean, I think in that 1968 housing discrimination case draws on the Civil Rights Act of 1866, because they're able to kind of say that they also meant non-discrimination in private contracts.
Was that the Shelley v. Kramer case, the case of racial covenants? No,
that was
1948.
This is 1968.
Okay. We're going to go to questions, but this has been fascinating, and I haven't even gotten to talk to you about like how you did your research in all of these different states, which must have been absolutely fascinating, and like how you kind of dug into records and stuff. I'm super curious. Did you have to travel a lot, or?
I did travel to play like Columbus, Ohio, and I went to Indianapolis. I did some really, for me, revelatory research in Boston, which is what allowed me to see all the stuff that was going on with Black sailors and the state legislature. But I also did a lot of research using digitized sources, particularly, because they can't always travel. And actually, now that so many 19th century newspapers are digitized, it's really quite amazing what you can do that way too. It was fun, and it meant a lot of. Also, one of the things that's really interesting is Google has digitized all these minutes of state legislatures. So like all of these things that, for example, I went to Columbus in part to look at the volumes of proceedings of the Ohio legislature, only to find out that like by 2 years later, they were all on Google Books. So that was interesting.
That's amazing. I didn't I've heard that project was in. I didn't know that it was like actually had come to fruition yet, but that is super great to know. Christopher Argyris, so nice to see you. Go ahead and ask your question.
To you. Thanks, Kate. And I have to say that I'm enjoying that this Kate Week has a strong, as a Northwestern alumnus, I'm pleased that this Kate Week has a strong Northwestern affiliation with Kate Shaw yesterday and Kate Masur today. So this question may not engage directly with your current work, maybe more so with your prior work, but I'll ask it anyways. So there are many issues today that continue to divide along old Confederate or Union state lines. And so I sort of wanted to ask, has the South ever really fully reintegrated into the Union, or did Reconstruction prematures and forestall that? And then just in terms of, I just wondered, curious what you thought about how we sort of still today draw major issues along this sort of north-south divide, 150 years after the Civil War, and what the origins of that is, and think about it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so I think that yes, absolutely, the southern states, the ex-Confederacy was reintegrated into the United States in some sense. You can't get rid of certain kinds of history, right? And I don't know, I'm always thinking about history, I guess, but I mean, we're just like wading in history all the time is how I see it. And so, for all intents and purposes, it would be meaningless to say that the ex-Confederacy was not reintegrated. I mean, think about, one thing that comes to mind is like, where are the military bases? Like, where is the army coming from? Like, we are that part of the country is just as American as any other part of the country in terms of institutions. And to kind of argue otherwise is to act as if those aspects of our country and of our history are somehow not really part of it. And they really are, right? And so I think that that it's just a really diverse, really, really big country. And also we don't really break down along those kind of regional lines anymore. And that there are certain patterns that have remained, and you can see some of them in voting patterns across, like, I'm sure you all have seen those maps of where African Americans live now compared to where the black belt of the southern soil was during the time of slavery, where Democratic voters live in the South is very parallel to where those places are. And yet it's doesn't totally hold true, right? Think of the state of Virginia, think of some parts of North Carolina, think of the conservatism of a lot of places in the Midwest, and so I think it really is of limited use for understanding the present to kind of reduce things back to the sectional division of the Civil War period, even though I'm not also saying that that stuff's irrelevant, because that's back to the weighting and history thing. Like we don't just like get rid of all of those things that divided this country, or like different kinds of religion, right? Different kinds of evangelical Christianity are also regionally thicker in some places than others. And so, these are things that have a deep, deep history, and yet much has changed as well. So yeah, it's a kind of both and typical historian answer.
No, I love that. I think that's great. Paula, so nice to have you. I love our like regular Paula like time now. It's but go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Hopefully this isn't too elementary of a thought, but I was just wondering if you think people or like the education system in the United States kind of fails to emphasize really how recent explicit racism was institutionalized, or at least how recent 1964 was. I just like think when I talk to people who don't think that the impact of racism or systemic racism still isn't present, when you just simply like I can say that my father was alive in 1964 just kind of is a horrendous thought to think about, that at some point, maybe when he was like 10 years old in the Middle East, that was happening here, or that it's only 2 generations ago. And for some reason, when you say that to people, it's almost like a light bulb in their head. But I don't know why growing up, or at least to me, like reading a AP textbook or a college textbook, that isn't abundantly clear. I don't know if you agree with that or can explain that.
I will just add to that
yeah.
really quickly, Paula. It was like I used to I remember having a conversation in one of those formative dorm moments, conversations when I was in like college, and like none of the women identified as feminists that were like in my dorm room. And I was like, but we couldn't have like gone to college. Like like a 2 generations, like literally like our mothers were the first ones to go to college or have the opportunity to go to college. And it was just kind of like there was definitely well, everything is equal now and we've gotten there, so we don't need to worry about this anymore. And I completely agree with Paula's thought process about how that switches over and changes. And we're obviously hopefully in a different moment, but it's a great question.
It is a great question. And I feel like I've been saying that to students my whole career, and this, when I started teaching college, like a really long time ago, and I would be like, this happened when your grandparents were alive. And they would be like, oh, and I think, I don't know. I mean, I think of course we should emphasize it more and do things to make all of this history more concrete and feel more real, and make people kind of help people understand that you don't just, whatever the argument, you don't just end slavery and presto, everything that it was associated with it goes away. Or you don't just end Jim Crow ostensibly with 64 and 65, legislation, and boom, presto, we are a changed society. Like think about all of, just among white people, right? Like just think of all of the bad things that white people learned about racial superiority and like who is worthy and who is not, that they just imbibed in the water of this country, that doesn't just go away when you change a law. And so you have to change the laws, and that's one of the key things that I'm interested in the book, right? And so you have to change the laws, but then that's not the end of the story. But I also just want to, in defense of history teachers too, like I do think that people have different capacities of absorbing this at different ages of their lives. Because so many people are, now like, why didn't I learn this in school? And I do sometimes think that you did learn it in school. It's just that you don't remember it, people just don't always take in everything that the adults around them want them to take in. And then you come back to it, right? And it's like an iterative process if you're interested and engaged in these kind of things.
Yeah.
I always remind myself that my parents got married in 1964, and so like a few years before I was born, de jure segregation was legal. I was born in 69, and 5 years before that, Congress had to pass a law saying that you could not keep black people out of lunch counters at the Heart of Atlanta Motel. And the cases upholding those are all in the period between when my parents got married and when I was born. you know, and some of them are later even than that. So I think Paula's point is right, that it's just hard to convince people that recent history is that recent, because, what feels long ago to us is very much a function of our own memories, and memory and history are very different things.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know. I think that the relativity of this is very real in both in time and memory, but I also just would say that the relativity in terms of the bubble that you're in, the people that you know, the world that you're a part of, right? Like, I would imagine that there are, and I know there are many, many places that feel more still incredibly, incredibly segregated in ways that are not so different than 1964 in the United States. And, but, I, like, coming from, like, a very Northeast liberal kind of bent, can look back and kind of, like, feel like there are these things of yesterday. But, part of it is bringing everything back up. So no, I'm so glad that you wrote this book. I'm so glad you came on and talked about it. We're going to leave it there. Ben, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Who is our Kate for tomorrow, Kate?
Katie Benner and Katie Conger.
Katie
of the
Benner.
New York
And we're going to have
Times,
to
both.
grill her on the
Katie's, you're having Katie's?
Yeah.
Oh, Kate Conger, Katie Benner.
Yeah, and we're going to have them fight about Katie versus Kate. Gloves
It'll
and
be
all.
a rumble.
That'll be 23 hours exactly from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But we do have rediscovered history of civil rights activisms in periods in which we don't think of it as having been born yet. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Kate
it's
Masur,
so great
thank
to
you
have
so
Kate.
much for joining us.
Come again
Thank you
soon.
for the great conversation. It was really fun to be here. And thanks to everyone who's been so lively on the chat.
You have a
too.
lot of fans that are buying your book right now. So
Awesome.
See you soon.